What is up, guys? We are back again with another video, and in today's video we are going to be discussing progressive overload methods. And the reason we are discussing this is because I was talking to one of my friends in the gym, and they were effectively saying what it came down to was that they were effectively saying they only knew how to progress by adding weight to the bar, right? And that's probably the case for a lot of people. The only way or the only method they've been taught how to progress is adding weight to the bar, and it's actually a fantastic method. It's probably the best method. However, it's not the only method, and it has its own flaws, especially if you kind of don't actually understand the principles of actually overloading what you're trying to overload, and we'll come to that now in a second when we discuss adding weight to the bar. However, there are a number of methods you can use to progressively overload your training. Now, of course, this comes back to understanding fundamentally what progressive overload is, and we've done articles on that. They're on site, etc. So if you haven't read those or you don't understand the concept, read up a little bit about progressive overload itself, right? So the first method of progressive overload, and it's probably the most simplistic and probably most underutilized method of progressive overload, is exercise execution training technique, right? And what I mean by that is like exercise execution or training technique. They're both the same concept. But what I mean by that is you can progressively overload an exercise, or rather what you're probably trying to do, progressively overload a muscle, structure, or system. And you can progressively overload that or them by improving the way you execute an exercise, right? So for example, say you're using dumbbell curls or actually it's an easier one. Say you're using barbell curls or an easy barbell curl for your biceps, right? And the entire time you've been doing it, you've been getting some return on investment. You're seeing some growth, some strength increases in your biceps, but you're at a stage where you can't really add more weight to the bar, and you're not really progressing like you want to. You're not seeing any growth in your arms, right? This, you could probably guess, a lot of people, especially if you've been to the gym, just the general population, you see a lot of people performing a bicep curl with a lot of momentum. They're going back and forth, and it's effectively some sort of low back exercise, the way most people perform it, and it's basically almost a variant of the Olympic lifts, the way most people perform a bicep curl, right? They're literally almost getting full triple extension when they're trying to get that lift, like, to progress. They're trying to add weight to the bar because that's the only way they can progress. They have to add weight every time they come in, or over a training block or whatever. And this, especially if you're trying to grow just your biceps, this kind of isn't actually progressive overload, right? Because you're not actually using the muscles you're trying to target by training that way. So actually regressing the weight back, so stripping it way back and improving the way you execute that exercise to actually target the tissues, the muscle tissues, the other structures you may be wanting to train, especially if you're an athlete. Maybe you want to train your tendons, your ligaments, that kind of stuff, or the systems, especially if it's like cardiovascular stuff or whatever. If you actually strip everything back and then perfect the manner in which you actually perform a repetition, like, you're actually going to see huge return on investment. In that example of the bicep curl, say you strip the weight all the way back and you're literally just using, just the bar, right? And you actually then initiate the entire movement, are in control of the entire movement with just your biceps. There is more tension on the biceps now than when you were throwing the weight around, potentially, so that is a method of progressive overload. So even though you're lowering the weight, improving the manner in which you exercise or you execute the exercise is a method of progressive overload, because you're actually putting more tension on the muscle over a training block because you've actually executed the exercise in a way that allows you to put tension on that muscle, right? And again, I call this regressive overload, because it is somewhat regressive in terms of you think you're progressing with just adding weight to the bar, but a lot of time you're using momentum and that kind of stuff, and actually regressing the weight you're using and then overloading. It's a much better method over time, especially for for newbies, because most people, if they're new to the game, new to lifting, resistance training, whatever, they don't actually have their technique mastered. And that's one of the key things to long-term progress, mastering your technique. So that's the first thing. Exercise execution. That's the first thing that you should be looking at when you are looking to progressively overload a lift, an exercise, a system, structure, whatever, right? The next thing then is range of motion. Now, this cuts both ways. You could increase the range of motion and see some progressive overload as a result, and you could also decrease the range of motion and see some progressive overload as a result. And an easy example of this is, say, the bench press, where you might perform the lift, and you say a newbie beginner, you might perform the lift and you're stopping halfway, even though you actually have the full range of motion here to your chest available to you, right? And then you might see progressive overload on the tissues, the structures you're trying to train, i.e. your chest, and by actually going down and touching your chest in that exercise, right? So increasing the range of motion could be a very viable way of progressively overloading that exercise. However, the converse could be true as well in a number of ways. The first one being, say you've always gone to your chest, right? But it's actually leading to a reduction in the amount of tension you're placing on your chest because you don't actually have that end range of motion. You're not able to get that bar to your chest. You're maybe, say, an inch off it, right? So performing that exercise with a limited range of motion, you could do, say, a 1-inch board press, if you really need to touch something to end that movement, or what people often call a spoto press. You could do that, and all of a sudden there's more tension on the actual tissues and structures that you want to train, rather than having that tension shift to other musculature, say like your bicep tendon or something. And as a result, you're actually progressively overloading what you want to progressively overload. So range of motion is a variable that you can manipulate to actually overload structures which you actually want to overload, right? So putting it down as a method of progressive overload. Now, again, the next one then is the weight you use, right? So again, this is the one that most people are familiar with. If you add more weight to the bar, that is progressive overload. So I don't think I need to go into this too in depth. However, the one thing you must keep in mind when you are discussing progressive overload by adding weight to the bar, that assumes that all the other variables are held consistent, right? And what I mean by that is, if you start out your exercise, your training program, and your technique looks a certain way, you're following certain variables, you're following a certain rest period, you're following a certain tempo, you're following a certain exercise execution, it looks a certain way. If you do 8 weeks of a training program and go, yes, I added 10 kilos, 20 kilos, whatever to that lift, but it looks completely different than when you started, you have not actually added weight to that exercise. You have just changed the exercise so that you can lift more weight. A classic example of this is people starting off their training program doing a bench press, and at the start of the training program, they'll have perfect, quote unquote, perfect technique where their hips will stay, their bum will stay on the bench, the bar will come down, touch their chest. It will look perfect. A powerlifter would look at that and be like, that is perfection, right? Whereas they get to week 8 of their program, they're like, yeah, I've added 15, 20 kilos to my bench press. And you look at that and all of a sudden they're bouncing it off their chest, and as the bar comes up, their hips are coming up every single time. And that's not the same exercise, right? So you haven't progressively overloaded that exercise, or potentially not even those same tissues. It could be completely different, shifting that tension to completely different musculature. Now all of a sudden it's some sort of like knee extension drive exercise, hip extension exercise, that you're not progressively overloading the tissues you want to now. So again, the exercise variables outside of the weight on the bar have to be held consistent. And if you do that one thing, you will see better progressive overload than if you just go, oh yeah, it's just weight on the bar, right? So yes, adding weight to the bar is a method of progressive overload, but that means that all the other variables have to be held consistent, okay? So if your exercise execution, technique, tempo, all those other things change, that's not the same exercise, right? The next thing then is the reps performed. This is probably the second most utilized method of progressive overload, and that is the number of reps you perform, right? Very straightforward with this in terms of, say you're doing, again, your bench press, you're doing it for like 8 reps, you're doing 100 kilos, 8 reps, you're like, cool, I'm not really able to add weight to the bar. it feels like my technique goes to crap after that. Or perhaps in your gym, the next jump up in weight, maybe they don't have, 1.25 kilo weights in your gym, it's only 2.5 kilos, and you're like, I can't really go up 5 kilos, it's too big of a jump. This is especially true if you're dealing with dumbbells. You might in your gym only go in like 2.5 kilo jumps, and that might be just too much for you to progressively overload by virtue of adding weight. If you're doing curls and you're using 10 kilos and you're like, well, I can't go up to 12.5 kilos, that's a huge jump. So adding reps over time is a method of progressive overload. For example, you could come up to a new weight, you haven't used this weight before, and the rep range you're trying to work in is like a 10 to 12 rep range. You might do that exercise with all your sets at 10 reps, right? And then over a training period, you might slowly accumulate more reps on each of those sets so that you eventually get up to your 3 sets of 12 now, right? So that could look like a progression of adding 1 rep each session you come in. That could look like every week adding another rep. It depends on how your overall training program is set up. And in the article, I kind of discussed a little bit more on that, but I'm going to move on to the next method, which is progressive overload via adding sets, right? And this again is just a method of accumulating more volume of work over your workout, because again, like say you do your 3 sets of 8 at 100 kilos on the bench press, and you're like, I can't really add reps, I can't really add weight, the weight jump is too big for me or whatever, and you're like, but I could do 4 sets of it, and again, these methods can also be combined as well. You could do 4 sets of it from 3 and go, okay, on that 4th set I'm going to start at, say again, you're doing the 6 to 8 rep range, and you're going to start at 6 reps. So your first 3 sets are 3 sets of 8 at 100 kilos, and you're adding a 4th set, but you're only going to 6 reps. And then the next workout, you're going to 7 reps. Next workout, you're going to 8 reps. And then you're going to maybe try increase the weight and decrease the reps, and then work the reps up over time. That's sort of a double progression. You could even have it a triple progression in terms of, again, you up the weight, lower the reps, lower the sets, and then over time build up the reps and build up the sets, while again over a few training blocks building up the weight. So again, some of these methods can be combined as well, but that goes into a bigger structure of a periodization and how your plan is set out over the weeks, over the months. And again, you have to be very clear in what you're trying to achieve and why you are progressively overloading in the manner you are progressively overloading, right? Because again, that is going to, like the goals that you have is going to dictate how you progressively overload, or which progressive overload method you prioritize, right? Because again, some of these things that we're going to discuss or have discussed, they're less appropriate for someone that's like, say, a power lifter versus someone who is, a bodybuilder, So again, your goals have to dictate the methods you use, right? The next one that we're going to discuss is, rate of perceived exertion or effort, or they're kind of the same thing, but different, reps in reserve, right? So you could progressively overload the exercise you're doing by continuing to do it, refining the movement until the RPE is lower, right? So if you were doing an exercise, and again, we'll say the bench press, 100 kilos, 8 reps, and you're doing, that's an RPE 9, you're like, maybe I could get another rep out there, right? You're like, I'm pretty confident I could, but it would be an intense rep, right? You might keep performing that exercise, the 100 kilos, 8 reps for a number of weeks, trying to refine the technique and slowly try to get that down to an RPE 8, an RPE 7. Same with the reps in reserve. You would try to, increase the reps in reserve over time, So if you're doing it again, the start of the training block, you're doing it and you're like, I only have 1 rep in reserve, and by the end of the training block you have 2 reps in reserve, again, that's progress. The only issue with this is it's obviously somewhat subjective and somewhat boring as well, especially if you're using the same weight all the time, effectively hoping for this esoteric, like, oh yeah, I feel like I have 2 reps left in the tank now, or oh yeah, that was actually a lighter RPE, but really you just had fucking 2 strong coffees before you got there, So it's a very esoteric one. I don't really use this. Obviously it is a method of tracking progressive overload. Like if you did 100 kilos by 8 and you look at your training log and you're like, okay, well today it was 100 kilos by 8 and it was an RPE 7. And I look back at my training program and it's like, oh, 8 weeks ago that was the same thing, but it was an RPE 9, So obviously I have done better, even though I'm only using the same weight, on paper, right? So it is a great way of tracking progressive overload, like assessing how you are progressing over time. However, I wouldn't use it as my method of progressive overload, if that makes sense to you. Next one then is tempo. This also has a few flaws with it, which I discuss in the article, but it is a good method of also progressively overloading, especially if you are stuck at a weight, or you're letting your technique get away from you. Because again, goes back with, again, some of these methods can work well together. This can work well with improving your exercise execution, having a set tempo to the exercise. And this also works well, especially if you do have somewhat of a strength goal, even though you might think that's somewhat dichotomous. But if your exercise execution, like the way you want to perform that exercise, requires that you have a tempo assigned to it, practicing that tempo and getting better at that tempo is obviously going to improve your exercise execution. Like I'm thinking in my mind here, if you're doing a bench press and you're a power lifter, actually adhering to the tempo that the lift must be performed at in competition is obviously better than if you don't adhere to that tempo. Now, obviously there are benefits to doing, say, like a touch and go bench press, so that you can overload structures without having to pause, dissipate some of that, energy. But again, you could use tempo in a strength setting. You could also use tempo in a muscle building setting. There's more time under tension on that muscle, in controlling your eccentrics, doing, say, a 3 to 5 second eccentric versus doing a 1 second eccentric. Obviously, effectively, they're two different exercises, assuming they're the same exercise, so you would be getting more overload. Now, the issues with this is there's a small degree of progressive overload available. Like once you get past, like, say, 5 second eccentrics, you're not going to be getting a huge amount of benefit from that, so adding time, it just becomes unrealistic, and again, like, it starts increasing the amount of time you're training in the gym, and potentially the reward isn't huge. However, what I do like tempo for is, as I said earlier, layering it on to that exercise execution thing where, we want an exercise to look a certain way. It's like, okay, let's assign a tempo to that so that we can ensure that that variable of exercise execution is held consistent. Again, you might want your squats to be controlled on the eccentric, maybe pause in the bottom, and then, do your concentric, So again, assigning a tempo of, like, say, a 3-1 X or a 1-0 tempo to that might be perfect, and then trying to hold that consistent as you slowly add weight to the bar, like, it's just a method of keeping that variable consistent, so while you can progressively overload it, for most people, I wouldn't really be progressively overloading this. I would just be using it, again, to standardize your exercise execution so that the other methods of progressive overload are more effective, The next thing then is, this is a bit of a cop-out for me, it's a bit of a lie to put it with this, but it does actually go here, and that is overloading the resistance profile to better match the strength profile. And what I mean by that is, you could modify the exercise so that it actually challenges the muscle more fully through its whole contractile range. Now, for some people this is going to require, or for most people it's going to require, some specialized equipment, either the use of bands, chains. Like, accommodating resistance is effectively doing this. Well, accommodating resistance done well is effectively doing this, and then also switching to exercises that better match your ability to produce force through the entire range. That's a great method of progressive overload, even though it is actually just switching the exercise, right? And what I mean by that is, you could go from something like a squat, where the way you squat is effectively some sort of squat good morning, and that's fine. That's the way you have to squat given your biomechanics. It's not your fault, but you're trying to overload your quads, so that might not be a great exercise for that. But switching to a well-designed hack squat that perfectly fits your structure, perfectly fits your ability to produce force through the entire range, that's going to actually progressively overload the tissues you are aiming to progressively overload, especially going to overload them more than doing an exercise that is supposed to target the quads, but for you does nothing for your quads, and all it does is build you a bigger ass, So again, it's a bit of a cop-out, because I'm effectively telling you to progressively overload by virtue of switching exercise, which, that's not really progressive overload. That's just, designing a better program, But it would be the case if you were doing, say, leg extensions, and your gym got a new leg extension machine that was, say, like a Strive Prime leg extension machine and you're able to overload certain portions of that range, like the way those machines are set up, that would be a better exercise to swap onto, even though it's the same exercise, it's a leg extension, you know? So they're matching the resistance profile and the strength profile is a method of progressive overload. It's just unfortunate that it's not really available to most people unless they have specialized equipment and they know what they're doing, you know? So you have to be educated in what you're doing with this as well. So that's why it's not discussed as much, because it's hard to disseminate that information in a little snappy video, you know? And the next thing that you can progressive overload is your rest periods. And much like some of the other progressive overload methods, you know, this has its limitations in that there is a certain amount of time required to recover so that you can optimally perform in your next set. This is especially true of strength, but it's also true of, you know, like hypertrophy. Even though, again, you'll see classically in like bodybuilding literature or whatever, they're like, oh yeah, 45-second rest period, but really all that does is limit your ability to execute the exercise effectively in subsequent sets. Even though, you know, I feel really pumped after it, it's probably not a great method. However, it is a method of progressive overload. And what I mean by that is if you go from doing your exercises, your sets for an exercise, and on all of those, you take 2 minutes rest, you know, if you get that down to 90 seconds rest, assuming all the other variables are held consistent, that is progressive overload. Now, whether you want to do that or not depends on what you're actually trying to achieve. You know, if you're trying to achieve some sort of metabolic stress to those muscles, you know, getting your rest periods down, so you're taking a minute rest period, getting those rest periods down to 45 seconds, maybe even 30 seconds, that may be very beneficial for achieving your goal of, you know, metabolically stressing those tissues, you know. However, if your goal is strength, I probably would not be focusing on reducing my rest periods. Even in the context of like hypertrophy, there comes a point of diminishing returns where, you know, you would be better off just focusing on one of the other methods of progressive overload, or doing some sort of intensity boosting technique, like say a rest pause set, or maybe even a drop set, if you are looking to really get your rest periods down a whole pile, you know. Final one then, and well, there's actually two more, but I just want to touch on the last one. The final one then here for the main ones is time in the gym, or the density of work you perform. And again, this is related to the last one in terms of the time you spend in the gym. If you want to progressively overload, you could effectively do the same amount of work, same reps, same sets, same exercises, same whatever, but do it in less time. Right? So if your workout normally takes you an hour, it would be considered progressive overload if you did that entire workout in 45 minutes. Now again, this is going to be more or less appropriate for certain goals, certain populations. However, it is a method of progressive overload, and it is a method, and what I mean by that is timing yourself in the gym is a method of ensuring that you are actually working hard in the gym, because you see far too often people just chatting in the gym, and I'm all for, you know, the gym being a social place. However, if you're taking 5 to 10 minute rest periods in between your sets so you can have a chat, that's probably not the best use of your time in the gym. You know, so if you're spending 2 hours in the gym and the majority of that is not working out or recovering in between sets of working out so that you can perform well in the subsequent sets, you know, timing your overall workout is probably a good idea. Related to this then is, you know, the density of work you perform, and I touched on two methods there, something like a rest pause or a drop set. You know, these are methods that you can increase the density of work you do in a given workout. So they may be an appropriate way to progressively overload your workout when you look at the amount of volume you have performed in a given workout, you know. So again, if you read the article that goes along with this, dive in a little bit deeper onto these things, and obviously then you have to understand overall training theory. So reading up on the training theory section on site is probably a good idea as well. Now the final one, which I just want to touch on to conclude and wrap up this video, is heart rate. Heart rate is a method of progressive overload. However, it's probably more applicable to cardiovascular training than it is resistance training. However, if you wanted to be the most pedantic person of tracking some sort of progressive overload from your training, you could track your heart rate. You could see how high your heart rate got on hard sets, and use that to somewhat quantify like RPE you could also then use it to see like how low your heart rate average can be throughout a given workout. You know, even though you're still going hard, you know, they are methods of progressive overload, you know. So again, probably more applicable to cardiovascular training, which I do recommend most people do, but it's probably not something that I would be actively looking to progressively overload in the context of resistance training. And then using it in a cardiovascular setting is a cardiovascular training method in and of itself, rather than a progressive overload method, if that makes sense. If it doesn't make sense, probably going to cover it in another video anyway. So I'm going to wrap this video up. Again, guys, if you do have any questions, comments, thoughts, issues with anything I've said, drop them below. If you could give it a like, comment, subscribe, do all that stuff. It really does help out with the YouTube algorithm. Anyway, guys, that is me. I am out. We will be back another day.